The tax system is a give and take. You pay taxes in, and that will benefit you either today or at some point in the future, unless we lose Social Security, which again, it's America. And as bad as we've been with managing money the last 5, 10, 15, 20, forever, we'll see if we have retirement to play with in the future. Now to the debt ceiling. While my goal isn't to always spend time on politics, political news, and drama, it is a fact that politics always runs in parallel with economic news. After months of political blame across the aisle on the debt ceiling, a tentative deal was reached between President Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy on May 27. This deal will suspend the debt ceiling for 2 years and set spending caps for fiscal years 2024 and 2025, with provisions and concessions from both parties. That is ultimately how negotiation should work, and I'm glad that we have made it to this point. The debt ceiling was raised to $31.4 trillion in December 2021, and it reached that ceiling mid-January of this year. The Treasury Department has been using what Secretary Yellen has called extraordinary measures to avoid defaulting on payments. Now, what is the debt ceiling? It's not a budget on what the government will spend or won't spend in the future. Yes, there's a conversation in that, and they're going to negotiate the spending and budget for the future, but the debt ceiling is the equivalent of having to pay your credit card, make a car payment, and a home mortgage for the next month. And if you miss those payments as you're late, you've effectively defaulted on those obligations. So that's exactly where the US government is they have a week, I think it's June 3rd or June 4th, that Secretary Yellen has announced that she has to have a deal in place to make these payments. This debt ceiling is one of those things that forces both sides of the aisle to actually negotiate, no matter how much they want to push their political agenda on each side, which quite frankly, we've lost any level of moderate politics since probably the Obama or before era. So pending the long-form alignment of the House and the Senate, this deal can become law before the middle of the first week of June, which was the hard deadline expressed by Secretary Yellen. So excited that there's a chance we may not hit default. So aside from the default in itself, we should see interest rates and the stock market stabilize a bit more than it has been over the last few months. In the deal, we'll see a cap on federal spending for the next 2 years, keeping non-defense spending flat in 2024 and an increase of 1% in 2025, while defense spending would remain untouched. This is down significantly from President Biden's budget request initially, which asked for a 16% increase in non-defense spending and a 1.7% increase of defense spending in 2024. So ultimately, I think the Democrats had to give a lot of the request up to keep spending flat, which will have a lot of impacts. Where cost of living has increased, now the federal government can't spend more to match that increase, which ultimately means that its programs and services that rely on the federal government to fund them will be impacted. That's education, that's infrastructure, that's environmental protections, that's healthcare, so forth and so on. There's also a provision in the deal that have Republicans excited. They've pushed hard to expand work requirements for recipients of food stamps, raising the age limit of childless adults who must work or participate in training from age 49 to 54. So since peaking at over 9% last year, the Federal Reserve has been fighting inflation by hiking interest rates in 2022. When the Feds raise their rates, it increases the interest rates of the debts that you take, whether it be your mortgages, new fixed loans or existing variable rate loans, credit cards, new car loans. It also crashes banks like Silicon Valley Bank or First Republic Bank because they have debts that they've issued to customers at low rates. They've also made investments in things such as bonds at low rates, but now they have to pay out more in interest rates to keep cash on hand. The Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC of the US Federal Reserve, is scheduled to meet again on June 13th through 14th. That's one of 8 meetings throughout this year. Many economists are predicting that coming out of this meeting, there will be a pause in rate hikes, which is extremely welcomed news. If there's a pause in rate hikes, it's a good time to invest those in fixed rate CDs, because if they pause the rates, that means there won't be any additional higher paying CDs to come out in the period of that hike. So it's a good time to go ahead and put money into CDs now. Now, I don't foresee a decrease in rates anytime soon. That's just not a reality from where we're at. We're still fighting inflation. Core inflation has remained high over 5% for several months. And this is one of the factors that the Fed looks at. Their target for core inflation is 2%. So we're at 5. We've been there for a while. They want 2. And there's also an additional factor that's unique. That's unemployment. In reality, the Fed wants to see higher unemployment rates than 4%. And that's where we're at. They want to see 10%. They want to see 15%. And they also don't want to see wages increasing by 4% because that means if people are employed, if they're getting raises, they can keep up with inflation, which justifies inflation, which keeps this machine going on and on and on. That's exactly why we go back to 2022, 2021, 2020. Of course, interest rates were lower. A lot of money was in the ecosystem. Everyone could afford to buy a bigger house, a more expensive house, and that increased the pricing of housing. And so as long as people can keep making money and they can keep getting raises, that does not help this conversation around interest rates. And so that's what the Fed is going to push for. But what's interesting is as the Fed is fighting inflation and they're increasing the interest rates, which increases the cost of servicing your debt, it has costlier mortgages, which means it's impacting the affordability of homes, which means the house that you bought for $500 might be worth $400 because the interest rate on that payment is now the equivalent of paying $2,000 versus $3,000 for that same sized house. That means lower spending power and reduced movement of cash. That is essentially the beginning of a recession. Recessions are closely correlated and impacted by interest rates. Higher interest rates equal lower economic activity. And as seemingly every company from Facebook to Microsoft is laying off employees, tens of thousands at a time. So it may already feel like we're in a recession because the companies are acting like it, right? But this is a debate that many economists are having. Are we in a recession currently, or is it still to come? But in reality, what I see this as, the companies are laying off to prepare for a potential recession, both in precaution, but both as a benefit to their immediate cash outlays, which is something that we should all be doing. It's approaching recession. We should be paying down our high interest rates, reducing our expenses and our obligations. So let's maybe not get a new car. Let's maybe not renew a lease. Let's evaluate what we're spending money on and be sure that it's the right spaces to spend money at the right interest rates. We should be saving cash, in higher interest products, high yield savings accounts, CDs. And I wouldn't have a lot in the stock market unless you have a high risk profile or you have a nice percentage of investments in, of course, stock market, but also in some of those fixed income assets.